All right, good afternoon. Welcome to this rainy Friday afternoon. With us today we have David Randy Padfield. Most of us know him as Randy. David currently works as a program coordinator of the fire training unit at Harrisburg Area Community College, where he coordinates development and delivery of special operations, incident command, and technical rescue and non-credit emergency management programs. And he also manages the development and evaluation of various functions and full-scale exercises. He also serves as a team leader with the South Central Task Force Type 4 Regional Incident Management Team and a member of Pennsylvania Type 3 Incident Management Team. David has been a member of Pennsylvania Task Force 1, one of 28 Department of Homeland Security FEMA urban search and rescue teams since its inception in the early 1990s, and currently serves as one of the task force leaders. Throughout his tenure with the team, he has been involved in various regional and national level incidents and events, including deployments to the World Trade Center on September 11th and Hurricanes Katrina, Earl, Irene, and Sandy. So, Randy, welcome to the Center's virtual seminar, and we will hand it off to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dwayne. This session is designed to be an overview of Pennsylvania Task Force 1's response to Hurricane Sandy and some of the operations that we're involved with. And at the tail end of the session, I also have some takeaways for emergency management personnel and some of the things that we saw in the area of operation. So we'll kind of discuss that as we go down through the overview. The initial part of the session is designed as kind of just a general overview of what happened day by day during the deployment. So you can go ahead and advance it to the next slide. Initially, this was kind of interesting for us because it started off originally, since we are really a federal asset, the state reserves the right to be able to keep us in state, and from a federal concept of operations, usually the state is going to be impacted and it houses or contains one of the federal task forces. A lot of times they take that out of national rotation for play nationally to be able to deploy them. And the concept behind that is that the task forces, that personnel are already going to usually be tied up in their own area of operation, responding to the effects of the storm or the disaster, whatever that happens to be. Initially, early on, we received a phone call, and we received information from Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency that they were going to release Pennsylvania Task Force 1 to be deployed nationally, and we were receiving information from the National Response Coordination Center, and the program office said that they would probably put us on alert and or activation orders prior to the storm because of our location to the coast and the anticipated impact. That changed overnight from the initial information that we had received, and we had expected alert orders the following morning. But however, Pennsylvania overnight decided to hold us in state as a state asset for deployment within the state, and that effectively took us out of the federal rotation. And then the NRC and the program office is working up a model to deploy other task forces around us, assuming that we're going to be committed in state. So it was kind of an interesting dilemma for us because it was going to be the first deployment after transitioning sponsoring agencies from Harrisburg Bureau of Fire to Philadelphia and the Philadelphia Fire Department. So we had gone through that process. It was a little difficult with the state early on because of their lack of familiarity, I should say, with the process as far as how we normally operate on the federal system. And one of the challenges that we ran into is getting an alert order and what all that alert order involves. Normally on the federal side of the house, our alert order is usually going to give us a spending cap of up to $10,000 to be able to start mobilizing and moving logistics personnel, readying the cash, readying the equipment, purchase of some commodities, and we're not to exceed $10,000 for that. We had received a verbal alert from Pennsylvania, but never received written alert orders until later on, many hours after the initial verbal alert came in. Eventually, it would go down to activate us. It would take a little time to be able to get us activated within the state. And one of the challenges we ran into is that working through the activation process with Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency is that the way the team is established, we respond, or we have responders that come from all over the state. And one of the challenges we ran into with the delay in the activation orders to be able to activate the team, as the weather conditions grew worse from Hurricane Sandy, and at about the time of activation that we officially received the activation orders, we already had tropical storm force winds in Philadelphia, which is our point of departure. So we had two individuals that when we finally received the activation orders were or did not feel that they wanted to travel during that time frame. So we actually had to change our roster slightly from what we had anticipated during the alert status to be able to fill those positions. And you can advance it to the next slide, Dwayne. The second day, we were originally on alert. We pulled in some skeleton personnel into the office. We started to work the alert status as we normally would. And then finally, the second day, we were activated. And again, it took us a while to be able to get that activation order. Like I said, some of the challenges, we received the activation orders at 15:20, as you see on the slide. We were anticipating a turnpike shutdown in 1900 hours, so that impacted travel because a lot of the folks were coming from the central part or the south central part of the state. So we were able to get through that, and probably, I think, between the total time from the initial activation until we were fully rostered, once we sent the alert or the activation order out, was about 3 hours, which was actually kind of remarkable for us because it was the first time we were deployed through Philadelphia or activated through Philadelphia. We had not had chance to be able to run through the mobilization process using a mobilization exercise. So this was kind of the litmus test for the mobilization plan as it stood. So we were able to get everybody in, and that entails travel en route, check-in, vehicle check, in processing, medical, the whole 9 yards, to the point where everybody's in and they're checked in and ready to go. One of the challenges, too, is our pharmacy still located, or at the time was still located at Hershey Medical Center. So we had to have a plan to be able to mobilize the pharmaceutical cache and get that down to Philadelphia as well. But all things considered, things went very well, and within 3 hours of us having the activation order, we were able to actually have everybody in place. At that point in time, they didn't anticipate any needs overnight, so we actually lodged or billeted folks overnight in Philadelphia. That was a little bit of a challenge, that we could billet our folks at a hotel, because a lot of the utility companies had already started moving their personnel into the Philadelphia area and the metropolitan area in anticipation of response to New Jersey and New York for the hurricane. So they had a lot of the rooms already tied up, but eventually we were able to get into one of the hotels, and we bed down overnight. Constant communications overnight with the State Emergency Operations Center, as well as some of the other, the Chief Deputy Director Fool, and also the coordinating the special teams response, who is actually Norm Oval. You can go ahead and advance it, Dwayne. The following morning, we actually base with the State Emergency Operations Center and also FEMA just to see what the status happened to be. They didn't anticipate, there were some impacts because of the storm, but they didn't anticipate any needs for urban search and rescue assets within the state at that point in time. At the same time, we were also working back channel with the National Response Coordination Center and the program office from the federal level. And at that point in time, they were actually activating additional federal USAR teams for response to New Jersey and also to New York State and the New York City area. We had posed the question to them that if Pennsylvania would release us from state activation, would they actually put us into work and give us federal activation orders? And we received an affirmative on that. So we worked that at about 9 o'clock in the morning. We received a verbal from the state of Pennsylvania that they were planning on releasing us as an asset of the state and that we would be available for federal deployment. And by about 9:45 that morning, we actually had our federal activation orders. We had verbal orders prior to that as soon as we let them know that we were being released from Pennsylvania. Kind of unique to this situation is that we were already rostered in state with water assets. The program actually has gone down the road on the federal side to be able to acquire water assets, but we have not as a team acquired all of the water assets to this at this point. But we also had water assets available through Philadelphia Fire Department to us, and we had mustered and rostered the team for in-state response with boats and all the additional equipment that we would need to be able to conduct flood evac operations. In the process of us transitioning into the federal system, our request was that please roster us with the boats and with the entire package we have, because it would make it a lot easier for us to be able to turn around and get out the door a lot faster, which they actually did. So we were able to take our boats with us and also our vans, which we normally don't take on a Type 1 response. So that worked extremely well from our perspective. So we received the activation orders through the federal government or the NRCC. They wanted us to go to Joint Base Dix McGuire Lakehurst. About an hour into travel outside of Philadelphia, we're actually in Trenton, New Jersey. We received an update from the National Response Coordination Center routing us Rockaways, and they had intel in the Rockaways, and they actually had folks from New York Task Force 1 and one of their task force leaders on the ground there saying that he could use up to 3 Type 1 federal USAR task forces to conduct search operations in the Rockaways. So that became a little problematic from our perspective, trying to route plan. We actually had personnel contact the New Jersey Operations Center to try to help us route plan around New Jersey into New York because of the tunnels being shut down, some of the bridges being shut down, and because of the travel routes being impacted. Unfortunately, bad information from the New Jersey Operations Center in the process, and they wanted us to go over the Verrazano Narrows Bridge and use the Bell Parkway. The problem is that, and we gave them parameters and the profiles of our vehicles that we have, including tractor trailers, things like that. They said we shouldn't have a problem. When we came over the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, we realized very quickly that we weren't going to be able to use the Bell Parkway in that route of travel because the Parkway had overpasses that had a clearance of sometimes as low as 8 feet. So that wasn't going to work with our fleet vehicles that we had. So we had to do some alternate route planning, which took us down Flatbush Avenue in Queens to be able to make it out to the Rockaways. And then once we hit the Rockaways, we ran into problems with debris in the roadway, those types of things. And on the slide, you can see one of the problems that we ran into in the Rockaways with one of the boats that was actually on one of the roadways. And eventually we would winch that off to the side and get it out of there so we could actually get some of our heavier vehicles past there. At that point in time, we met up with Maryland Task Force 1, who was already on the ground in the Rockaways conducting search operations. Massachusetts Task Force 1 had arrived shortly before us with their advanced element, and we met up with Fire Department of New York at one of their command vehicles, along with meeting up with our branch director from the Federal Incident Support Team. At that point in time, they had planned to backfill us in the Rockaways, and they actually wanted to send us out to Nassau County on Long Island for our area of operation. So at that point in time, we departed the Rockaways and continued into Long Island. And they were actually the plan was to meet us up with Indiana Task Force 1 as another Type 1 federal asset and put us into the Nassau County Emergency Operations Center or their Office of Emergency Management. So eventually we would transition to Nassau County. We arrived at their Office of Emergency Management. We got a briefing from their personnel. Some of the incident support team members from the federal side were on the ground, and we worked out essentially a footprint of where we were going to bill it and how we were going to get our assets in. And Dwayne, you can go ahead and advance the slide. That night when we arrived in theater, we arrived first. We were able to get most of the logistics figured out and work with the folks from Nassau County Emergency Operations Center to be able to determine the best placement and also to get some local intel. So at that point in time, we were working on some local intel of what they had. We were getting a lot of information that this was worse than Katrina. It was Katrina-esque. And these were coming in from the locals. And what was actually kind of nice is their communication center was there. So we were able to go down to their emergency operations center and their communication center and then get some local intel that was coming in as part of that. At that point in time, once we co-located with Indiana Task Force 1, we started to develop a plan of attack for initial recon of the site and the areas that they wanted us to target. So we worked with Indiana Task Force 1. There was also a component of New York Task Force 2, which was an in-state urban search and rescue asset that they had that was already working in the area of operation. So they were able to actually pull them back, and we were actually able to work the following day a joint recon plan to be able to send folks downrange and start to get some recon. One of the issues that we had when we pushed the recon teams out is there was a significant amount of impact to the area. It wasn't as bad as Katrina or what we were used to seeing in Katrina. However, the challenges that our teams were running into is that they had no curfew or anything like that. And the issue was that in the process, all the locals were still coming back into the area, and we had what I affectionately call disaster tourists showing up in the area of operations to see the impact, which made travel and convoy to the site very difficult from our perspective, and actually movement within the area of operation very difficult at that point in time. One of the other challenges is trying to figure out what our concept of operations was going to be, what our rules of engagement were going to be, and what our reporting requirements were going to be. So in the process of dealing with the local authority having jurisdiction, we had an element of the state incident management team that we were interfacing with. They came up to the point where they wanted information every 2 hours on number of areas searched, number of buildings searched, and all that other stuff, which complicated from our perspective because downrange communications was extremely poor. We had pretty much no cell phone coverage. Radio coverage from our base of operations to our forward operating area was very difficult because of the distance in between. Nassau County Office of Emergency Management was a great base of operation. However, the problem was that it was some distance from our area of forward operation. So that created some problems for us from that perspective. And our communications specialist started to troubleshoot that. And pretty much the first couple of days, our communication was all via sat phone at that point in time to be able to relay information back and forth. There were some issues or challenges, I should say, working with the county commissioners in Nassau County to be able to get the rules of engagement of what they actually wanted us to do and how they wanted us to engage in that area. Eventually, we were able to agree on some rules of engagement of they wanted to do a door-to-door search. They wanted to make sure that everybody was accounted for and those types of things. Initially, from our recon teams going downrange, it didn't appear that we had a lot of work because people were already trying to reoccupy, or the folks actually rode the storm out in their houses, which is what created a lot of the challenges. Locally, talking to a lot of the locals, they evacuated for Hurricane Irene. However, Hurricane Irene wasn't even anywhere close to what they thought. So when they were issued the evacuation this time, a lot of them decided to stay because they compared it to Hurricane Irene and they didn't want to evacuate. So in the area of Long Beach, which is where we were assigned, the challenge happened to be that most of the people didn't evacuate that area. They did some targeted evacuations at the hospital and some nursing homes and some other places that exist on Long Beach, but other than that, they did not evacuate en masse from Long Beach. Dwayne, you can go ahead and advance the slide. One of the challenges was trying to find a footprint to put two USAR task forces, two Type 1 USAR task forces. Originally, the incident support team thought that we would be able to bill it in was office space. They told us that we were okay to use that in cubicles and everything else, which created a little bit of a challenge for us. One of the other things that we ran into working with some of the locals and some of the folks that knew the system, they said, well, we have a large area up in the second floor, which is actually not finished. Which gave us the ability to be able to bill at both teams up there. One of the challenges from the slide that you can see, unfortunately, there was a lot of drywall dust on the floor, and we actually had to engage our safety officers because there's still protective dust covers on a lot of the alarm system components and those types of things. So we had to develop a safety plan, but that gave us the largest billeting area to be able to put our people into, and worked out a lot better than the office space and the cubicle space they originally planned to give us, because it would have been very tight to get our 80 personnel in there to be able to sleep bed them down and sleep them. So that created a little bit of a problem. Go ahead and advance it, please. This is a shot of us doing some USAR recon and search planning with Indiana Task Force 1, the component of New York Task Force 2, and some of the incident support team personnel. One of the things that we had access to that is always crucial for us on federal missions or any mission is getting maps of the area. And luckily, we had a GIS department that was able to blow some maps up for us and be able to print out some relatively detailed maps. So this is one of the searching sessions where we we're taking as much local intel as we can. We're working with Indiana and the component out of New York Task Force 2 and the IST to determine or develop our search plan. When we did the initial recon, like I said, we didn't think there was going to be a lot of work, but then they wanted door-to-door searches on top of that. So then we were trying to figure out door-to-door wise where we were going to deploy our assets and what was going to be the most effective. And we broke down the search area. Eventually, we would end up with about 31 map segments within the area of our area of operation. We tried to essentially lay them out based on population density and or density of housing and structures that were in those areas, because then we could have a pretty consistent rate of clearance if that worked for us. The areas that we were concentrating on were Long Beach, which you can see where Tom's actually pointing to on that picture, and then the area of Island Park, which is right above it. They were the most impacted areas, and really the area of Long Beach is almost a barrier island that was completely underwater when the hurricane made landfall, and like I said, most of the people did not evacuate. There were also areas or fringe areas on the South Shore of Long Island that we were getting reports in that would eventually need to be searched because of impact from floodwaters and things like that and tidal surge. So the Emergency Operations Center was taking those reports, and as we got those reports and they were refined, we'd add them to our search segments and further refine the search process. So initially we start out with paper and stubby pencil to be able to start quantifying the search and figuring out our search process. You can go ahead and advance it, Dwayne. And this is what it looks like. This is not the complete map, but this kind of gives you the area of Long Beach, which is down at the bottom part of the slide, and then Island Park. And then you can see some of the finger areas on the South Shore that we were getting reports in. So eventually we would grow this as operational periods increased, or as we got into the incident, that I think total we had 31 map segments in our area of operation that we targeted to be able to be searched in a door-to-door fashion. Go ahead and advance. This is what it ends up equating to, is that we end up developing or essentially applying ICS or NIMS ICS to it, and then printing out the search maps, and then our search teams are taking a look at putting those maps together, and then our search team managers are saying, okay, this is how we're going to essentially deploy our personnel within the area of operation. One of the things that became challenging for us is the quantifying the search area and being able to qualify what we've done and what we've completed. And we've probably done more wide area search in the federal system than we have actually engaging in collapse structures and shoring and breaching and breaking and those types of things. And most of what we do is documented by GPS. One of the challenges that we ran into is trying to figure out exactly what documentation was going to be needed. And there was some discussion at this point in time of whether we actually mark each individual building that we're coming up or residential structure we're coming up on with a set of GPS coordinates and a waypoint, or do we just leave the track log on the GPS units and just let that record as our search teams go down the street, assuming that most of the people are already or have tried to reoccupy or are still in the area of operation. And what we found out is because of the building density that was in the area, we chose the option of just letting the track log on with our search team so we know that which streets we touched and which streets we did not touch. And it made it a little simpler because it's a little bit more time consuming, and literally some of these beach bungalows are 20 feet apart, so you would have waypoints and on top of waypoints, and it would potentially cloud things when it came to data collection. Defining that a huge issue on the side, because on the fly they wanted us to upload standard icons to our GPS units, which we can't do very well on the fly, which became a little bit of a problem for a lot of the teams. And we were just ended up, if it was an issue, if we found human remains or somebody needed something, we would mark that as a specific waypoint. If it was a critical infrastructure issue, we'd mark that as a specific waypoint. But otherwise, with the wide area search going up and down the streets, we just left the track logs on the search teams. Go ahead and Dwayne and advance it. And this is some of the impacts we saw in the area of operation. Obviously, if you live 2 blocks back from the beach, you now had beachfront property. And just navigating around on the lower left-hand side of that slide is a fire hydrant, the bonnet of a fire hydrant that is about a block back from the beach. One of the things that we negotiated, or that actually the authority having jurisdiction wanted us to do, is that when we searched, we have standard marking and standard data collection. And what they wanted us to do is they did not want us to sticker any building with a search sticker if we found people at home. They did want us, however, to sticker buildings where we did not find anybody at home, and we could not force entry unless we had a high probability that somebody may have still been in the house and been incapacitated. If we were going to force entry, we had to actually notify local law enforcement, have them come down to the specific residential structure so they were present when we forced entry, and they could actually log that, and then we would try to secure wherever we forced entry. Now, one of the challenges first off is that with a large amount of people still in the area of operation, they were coming to us and they wanted to know, well, I didn't get a sticker on my house. To go about getting a sticker on my house because they did not know what the stickers meant. They thought they needed to have a sticker on their house for aid, for individual relief, those types of things, and that wasn't necessarily the case. However, a lot of folks were concerned about looters, and that's why they did not want to leave their residential structures, even though they were significantly impacted and or damaged down along the beachfront. And one of the things that the locals came up to us and said, it's really nice doing this, but you're actually securing buildings that are vacant or have nobody home. So when people come in to loot, they know exactly which buildings to loot because there's nobody home at that residential structure. So we funneled that jurisdiction and said, listen, this was brought up to us by the locals. So the next operational period, we actually changed the plan to the point where we weren't stickering any buildings, and all we were doing is data capture with GPS track logs and or waypoints if they qualified for a waypoint. You can go ahead and advance, Dwayne. We talked about some of these issues. This became more of a health and services issue for us. There wasn't a lot of search to be able to do. We had a few structures we could not get confirmation on whether people had evacuated or whether they had, family had come to get them. So we did have to search some structures and force entry into them. But downrange, the people that we were running into wanted to do the right thing. They just needed to be given the right information. If you looked at the town of Long Beach and their website, they had an unbelievable website with a lot of information on it for recovery operations. The problem is there's no power, there's no telecommunications, there's no internet, there's no anything in Long Beach. So getting the information, we were encountering them, and at one point in time, our search crews are coming back on, and they're telling us, these people are asking us 3 simple questions, and we can't answer them. So can we get this information? And what we found out is the city of Long Beach and their emergency management had a lot of that information, and eventually they would find us and bring these flyers out so we could distribute the flyers, which actually worked out extremely well. But communications was a huge because there was just no cellular communication at all. Fuel became an issue. And the impact to the area with disrupted services was key. The health and human services component of it, of people not being able to get to pharmacies and those types of things. The hospital was evacuated, grocery stores, mail service, and you still have a lot of people living in the impacted area. And that was a lot of the problem or challenge that we were dealing with. And to give you an example, we had one lady that we encountered who did all the right things to try to get a prescription refilled. And what happened was that it was a controlled substance. It's an anti-anxiety medication. Her doctor, his house was impacted in Long Beach. She went to the hospital normally in Long Beach. That was impacted and evacuated. She also went to, she tried to go off island to another pharmacy, but because she had 0 refills, they wouldn't refill her prescription. So she tried all the appropriate avenues, but she just could not get that taken care of because of the services that she's so used to were not available in the area of operation. So we were seeing a lot. people that were still in their houses that were end-stage cancer patients that are on pretty significant pain management medications, and they were going to be running out of their pain management medications. They did not want to evacuate. They didn't want to go to a shelter. So we encountered a lot of those as we went down through. We encountered a lot of changes within the area of operation of people that are trying to recover, and our hazmat specialist actually picked up that a lot of residential structures where they were operating backup generators or portable generators had significant amounts of carbon monoxide in the structure. So we were actually trying to educate some of the citizens on standoff distances for generators, ventilation, those types of things. Go ahead and advance, Dwayne. So again, these are the infrastructure and travel issues. We talked about working with local public works just to be able to get around and get some of the streets cleared and those types of things. Go ahead and advance. Debris management became an issue. Like I said, these folks wanted to recover. There's a lot of misinformation that's out there. People are coming up to us and saying, well, you know, do I have to keep everything in my house till the insurance company comes? Can I take pictures of it? How do I do this? Getting that information out through the emergency management food chain was kind of crucial, because we had folks that may or may not have been accounted for, but we also had folks that were actively trying to recover and get the goods and everything else out of their building and try to move on with life. And that was the hard part, is trying to balance that. The only time they did 100% ID checks was after sundown, where they required ID checks for anybody coming into the area of operation, which made daylight operations for us very difficult because of the traffic issue, everything else that was going on. Go ahead and advance. Eventually, they would give us 2 more federal task forces in that area of operation for Nassau County. So we go from 2 to 4 total. The problem with that is that the Nassau County Emergency Management does not give us enough of a footprint to house 4 task forces. So eventually, they moved to Hicksville High School, which is the new base of operations. At that point in time, we actually have 4 USAR task forces on the ground, or eventually we'll have 4 USAR task forces on the ground. We set up a rather large task force control center, and we start doing joint planning with all 4 element leaders from and planning team managers from the 4 task forces. We have a small element from the Federal Incident Support Team, but a fairly large portion of the Federal Incident Support Team is still working out of Herndon, Virginia, which posed some challenges for us because of the distance away. So we're working up the plan to be able to, incorporate all 4 task forces into the search areas that we already identified. By this time, we actually have support. One of the flyaway teams from the NGA, National Geospatial Agency, is on ground with us, and they actually have their plotters, and they're actually now taking everything we were doing in paper and stubby pencil and highlighter and hash marks and things like that on a regular paper map, and now they're able to make some displays for us on search progression and everything else. And they're also be able to get us some more detailed maps of the area, which worked out extremely well. Go ahead and advance. This is just some shots of the Hicksville base of operations. One of the challenges is not a lot of showers. So the picture on the left-hand side, we end up doing field showers. And in reality, even this footprint did not give us what we needed. It was very tight with 4 Type 1 task forces with all the equipment we have and everything else. We really could not have fit any other federal assets on the ground there to be able to assist us, because we really didn't have the footprint to be able to support it. Go ahead and advance, Dwayne. We talked about the NGA being on location. They're producing maps. We have some additional planning support from the Incident Support Team on location. And the new plan is going to, this is one of the other things that was kind of a little controversial. This is the first time that the ESF-9 federal component has ever had air assets assigned to it out of the box from the initial start of an incident. Normally, we get assigned to us after everybody else is done using the air assets, then they become available. We actually had air assets assigned to us sitting out of Dix McGuire, ready to go. So there was a pretty big push to be able to use those air assets. And the plan that we developed when we had 4 task forces on the ground is some of the fringe shore area that we had reports of damage. We were actually planning on bringing and flying those task forces out of McGuire up to be able to conduct search ops during the daylight hours, and then actually fly them back to McGuire at night. So that incorporated the plan with 4 task forces on the ground in Nassau County, that we incorporated those air assets, and the incident support team was coordinating that from their perspective to fly search teams in on CH-47s or Blackhawks 60s to be able to get them on the ground. They would search. They'd have a certain time hack. They could be on the ground, and then they would fly them back. Now, this worked out relatively well, with the exception of the reporting requirements. We didn't necessarily, the areas they searched, they didn't necessarily report the same information that our teams on the ground were reporting. So this became a little bit of a challenge trying to get their numbers in the areas that they cleared, number of residential structures they cleared, and those types of things. Go ahead and advance, Dwayne. And this is just, how the search progression maps out. Like I said, we start off with paper and stubby pencil early on. We used highlighters for different areas. We used hash marks on there and made maps or notes on the maps as we were able to clear those areas, the areas that were searched, those types of things. Go ahead and advance to the next one. And eventually, when it's on the ground, they're able to produce a lot more detailed maps for us with a lot more shading, and we're able to work with them. And this just gives you kind of a better enhanced view of it. And what you're looking at here is you can see actually on the lower part in some of those red areas are actually the GPS track logs of the areas that were searched by the federal teams. Go ahead and advance one more. And this is what it equates to. This is just a Google Earth capture of the USAR search tracks. And then you can see it going, the search tracks and the GPS track logs going up and down each street. And this is just from our USAR task force. Eventually, all this information is brought up, it's uploaded, it's given to the incident support team, and then they have, hopefully can develop a search progression and maintain a common operating picture of where we're at in the search process based on the parameters we were given by the authority having jurisdiction. You can go ahead and advance. So we continue to complete search operations there. Teams in the field on day 7, and the run into is the incident support team comes to us and says, listen, we're going to be moving Pennsylvania Task Force 1 out of Hick. We're actually going to move you down to Floyd Bennett Field in the Rockaways, or just outside the Rockaways. We really didn't have a good idea of what we were doing at that point in time, so we sent an advance element down. We find out where we're going to be billeting, which is actually on an old, and we get the rest of the team down there, and it takes us to about 0300 hours the following morning to be able to get our main base of operations set up, which includes all the Western shelters, the sleeping tents, the task force control center, the medical boo, getting everything set up at that point in time, including the heaters and the tents and everything else. Well, one thing about Floyd Bennett is they actually flew a contingent of Ohio Task Force 1 in to be able to help us set the base of operations up. The reason being is that our search crews were out searching the entire day, and we did not get to Floyd Bennett until just before midnight. So our guys were already pretty tired from being out most of the day, walking and conducting searches in the area of operation. And then when we got to Floyd Bennett, we had to set up the full task force control center and the entire base of operations essentially for the task force. Go ahead and advance to me. This is when we debrief essentially that they wanted us to change missions. It now became more of a humanitarian mission for us, and we were actually going to be the main supporting base at Floyd Bennett, and we were going to pretty much run a distribution center for food, heater meals, blankets, those types of things for the folks that happened to be in the Rockaways. They still had a fair amount that were impacted in the Rockaways. We weren't sure of the magnitude of the problem, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, but what they were doing is, because of the billeting issue in New York City, the game plan was we would provide a forward logistics base essentially with everything that we would need. All the task forces that were housed at Joint Base Dix McGuire Lakehurst were actually going to offload their box trucks. They were going to bring them up by ground, and then they were going to fly the personnel up, and then we would actually send people out into the Rockaways on a humanitarian mission to be able to go check people out, check specific addresses out, and provide commodity distribution in that area. One of the things kind of interesting New York State IMT located us, and they wanted their paperwork because they were worried about crunching numbers. So we actually had victim contact sheets that we were using for everybody we came in contact with door to door, how many people were sheltered in place, what their needs happened to be, those types of things. So we were capturing all that data. One good thing is the NGA actually followed us, which helped us significantly because they set up shop with us on the field at Floyd Bend. Go ahead and advance. We can just kind of discuss this a little bit. One of the challenges too is the election. We had 86 deployed, and when you deny them their right to vote, that becomes a little bit of a sticking point with a lot of the folks that were there. So we tried to troubleshoot that as best we could, but there was actually no very good way to be able to do that or easy way for us to be able to submit absentee ballots or anything else, especially at the last minute. So we committed some folks to be able to do that, but unfortunately we were able to get a couple of them through because the election bureaus didn't quite understand that we're living in the middle of a runway outside of the Rockaways in New York without a lot of connectivity to the outside world. We actually provided some other to some of the other entities there. One of the challenges we ran into about day 9 is that a lot of the healthcare insurance plans right now, our members are supposed to deploy with 14 days worth of medication. We can actually be extended to 20 or 21 days. When they show up, a lot of times their healthcare insurance is not covering additional medications or a refill. So we actually, our medical component had to coordinate getting refills of critical medication, prescription medications for our members at that point in time. Go ahead and advance, Dwayne. The Nor'easter, we have information on that. That's on its way. So that's, we got a base operation set up with tents. We're doing commodity distribution. We're doing all this other stuff. We're also given a vulnerable client list that was produced by Office of Emergency Management, which I think came from Health and Human Services, of their clients they were unable to make contact with, that they wanted us to go out and specifically go to these addresses and touch base with the clients to see if they were there, if they evacuated, if they have any needs. So we were trying to do a lot of that to be able to support emergency management and get out there, and again, more of a humanitarian mission at this point in time. When the Nor'easter's on its way, they decide to pull us back to Joint Base Dixon-McGuire-Lakehurst and billet us there. At this point in time, they pretty much demob most of the other task forces. So we're at this point just about the only federal task force that is still activated at this point in time. So go ahead and advance, please. This just gives you a shot of the vulnerable client list. One of the challenges that we had with this is they gave it to us in a PDF format, and they didn't give us the ability to be able to filter it. And the streets were all over the place. So to be able to break it down from a search perspective, we actually want our search team managers to be able to say, okay, let's get all the clients on this street, and we can potentially go out and have one search team be able to hit all these clients. It took us probably about an hour to manually filter this list and divide it up between the search teams because it came to us in a PDF format and in a printed format, and we had no good way to be able to put it in Excel or to filter it out of the PDF format. Go ahead and advance. Day 11 is the Nor'easter hits. We're at the Dix-McGuire-Lakehurst Joint Base, and we're trying to get caught up on things at this point in time. Mostly our paperwork, our 214s, our unit logs we get caught up on, our 225s. We're anticipating demob orders the next day. We were really the only force that didn't fly or have any aviation operations. So we said, the next morning while we're waiting for demob orders, we'll set up some training, some airframe familiarization training with our personnel, and we'll take them over to the airfield and get that taken care of. So we walked through that process to be able to get that taken care of. Go ahead and advance. The one problem is we completed the helicopter training and the airframe familiarization that morning. Everybody was anticipating demob orders around noon. We were told by the IST to anticipate it. We are the only federal task force that's still activated at this point in time. They're de-escalating everything else. What happens is about noontime, they call us back in and brief us, and they said, you guys are still smiling on the inside, aren't you? And we said, why? And they said, we just had an urgent request to send you back to Floyd Bennett. We're not exactly sure why, but this came through the IMAC. At that point in time, we an advanced team forward. We go back to Floyd Bennett. Now the runway that we were billeting on is now completely filled with recreational vehicles for temporary housing and flatbed trailers with generators, large-sized generators on. So we have now lost our billeting location. So we set up with a Marine Corps Reserve base that is actually in that area that we can at least billet our folks there overnight until we get a better plan if we have to stay in the area of operation for any extended period of time. Go ahead and advance. This is the problem that we ran into and the reason that they actually brought us back. One of the challenges they ran into is in the Rockaways, they had a huge number of multi-story, multi-residential buildings that really nobody had made contact with all of the residents in the buildings. I think it was day 9 of our deployment, we had teams in the Rockaways that actually encountered somebody on the 27th floor of a building who was wheelchair bound, who had absolutely no contact with the outside world, who's living there with no heat, no light, and limited food and water. So they brought us back because they knew the magnitude of the challenge that they had ahead of them, and they wanted to see whether we could help them. And what you're looking at here is the blocks are U.S. National Grid 1 kilometer squares, and anything in green are buildings, and we work with the GIS analyst to be able to get us this information. These are buildings that are 4 stories or greater in height that are multi-residential occupancies. And then the numbers within the 1 kilometer square grid zones are actually the number of domiciles within that grid zone. So when you add all this up, it ends up to be over 22,000 separate domiciles that are in multi-story, multi-residential buildings that potentially need to be checked because there's been nobody make contact with the folks that live there, whether they've evacuated, whether they're still living there. And there's absolutely no power to this. People are living with no power, no light, no source of heat, which becomes the problem. So we work overnight, we develop the plan, we put the meat of the bones on the plan and say, listen, we need a couple more Type 1 task forces, we need Health and Human Services personnel, we need force protection to be operating in the area here because of some of the challenges of some of the areas where lower socioeconomic status, and after you've been without services for a long period of time, people get a little hostile at times. So there are things that we are concerned about. Go ahead and advance the slide. What we did is apply ICS to it. We broke it into 3 divisions for the plan: Division A, Division C, or Division A, Division B, and Division C. And the reason we did this is, if you take a look at Division A and B, they have about the same number of domiciles, and Division C has about twice the amount of domiciles as what A or B would have. And that was just to be able to break it down for resources as far as how many resources we would need. So we worked up the plan with the resources, went through that process, put the plan together, and it actually went to the program office to the point where the branch director came down and met with the locals and said, listen, we could do this for you if you wanted us to, but we're really not the best asset for us to be out there doing that. We could do it, but you probably have other assets that are better equipped, or you can put assets together that are better equipped to go out there, because our rate of clearance on multi-level structures, if people are living there, everybody's probably going to have a need at this point in time, and it's really going to slow us down. And, how many people evacuated, how many people are still living there? Probably a fair majority of the folks are still living there. In the process, they're still trying to establish emergency power with generators to a lot of these larger complexes, but just by putting emergency power back to them isn't going to fix the issue, because now they've been 9 or 10 or 12 days, and the living conditions there just aren't the best at that point in time. Go ahead and advance, Tony. This is what it looks like working with the NGA folks. They were able to give us 1 kilometer square grids. This is one of their tools. This is a disaster planning atlas that they have available to us. Go ahead and advance. This will be the next slide, is just the street level view. So we have, go ahead and advance again. And out of that 1 kilometer square grid, they're able to give us an Excel spreadsheet of all the buildings within that 1 kilometer square grid that are greater than 4 stories, and the number of units or residential units that happen to be in there. So they worked all this up. We told them what we were going to need once we actually applied ICS to our plan and put our plan together. So this was instrumental in us being able to get out the door to be able to do that. So this is one of the tools available to them that makes our job a lot easier in the field. Go ahead and advance, Tony. Finally, we go home. This is the last day that we talked about. We actually, Chief Endercat comes up and actually interfaces with the locals and Office of Emergency Management. Says, listen, we're really not the best asset for this. So eventually we get demo borders and we get back to Philadelphia and end out the mission. Go ahead and advance again. Just to round things out, some of the incident management and coordination challenges is the multiple levels of government and the response of coordinating that. And everybody that that's involved with this knows that the challenge was coordinating with the locals, just the emergency management. We're out in the area of operation. We're dealing with the locals. A lot of times we're the first asset that they're seeing, and they have questions for us. And if we don't have the information from the local emergency management officials, we can't give them the appropriate information. And that was a frustration early on that we were eventually able to fix. The coordination of planning efforts, we had folks that we felt we were doing a very good job in the area of operation, especially with 4 task forces on the ground doing joint planning. But we also have the incident support team trying to plan back in Herndon, Virginia, and they're remote from the area, and that becomes a little bit of a challenge. Dealing with that remoteness of what's going on and syncing those plans, what they're doing versus what we're doing on the ground. Politics come into play, the 2-hour reporting requirement, all those other things that came into play. They're all AH-driven types of things. We did have some issues in the area of operation where we met some of the local elected officials. They want us to do some other things that necessarily the county commissioners may not have wanted us to do, or they had different priorities. The big thing was the control of the area of operation, like we discussed, and then that balancing of the daily life and recovery efforts of the affected public within the impacted area, and also while you're still trying to do some of these other operations. That became a little challenge for us. Go ahead and advance, please. We talked about some of the stuff internally, the advisory, the alert, the activation procedures, and some of the challenges that we had dealing with PEMA. It's their first time activating us as a resource like this with essentially a new administration. So it was a little curve on their behalf. It was a learning curve on our behalf because it was the first time we mobilized through Philadelphia. The transition from a state to a federal response asset, that's kind of the first time we've ever done that before as a task force. It worked out relatively smoothly. However, on the back end, there's a lot of paperwork accounting because we have a state alert, a state activation, then we went to federal activation. So tracking a member's time, expenditures, those types of things became a little challenge from a grants management perspective. We talked about the downrange communications issues in the area of operation, especially early on, the first 3 or 4 operational periods. We really had no cell communication. That's what a lot of people rely on. We really were using sat phones, and eventually we were able to get a repeater up to be able to make that happen and have consistent communications. The other change we had is movement of our BOO locations. As a task force being deployed for 14 days, we moved our base of operations location 5 times during the response. And that becomes a significant detractor. It beats up our logistics personnel and really wears them down when you're moving the base of operations that many times, especially if you're going to have a very large footprint. It's not too bad if you're billeting inside of a hardened structure already, but when you're living in the tents and you're ripping the tents down, setting the tents back up and things like that, it really takes its toll after a while. Go ahead and advance. This has been, from a federal AAR perspective, deviation from a standard hurricane ops model. Normally what they would do is take 3 closest task forces to the area of landfall, and then they're going to start taking a look at a central and west model. The last couple of times for hurricanes, they've deviated from that model. And essentially, I think that what came out of the AAR is that for the first 24 hours of an incident, they're going to take the closest task forces geographically to any incident if they need additional resources. This is the first time we were deployed with water assets, and we have Hurricane Floyd on there in 1999. That was the first time we realized we needed water assets, and it's taken us this long as a federal response asset to be able to get the water assets to us, or get them at least on the federal equipment list. We had air assets to us, which we discussed. It's the first time out of the box that we've had those air assets. The one big thing was the integration of the air operations into the tactical action plan. That took a little bit for us to be able to figure that out. And we were kind of forced into that a little bit by the incident support team because they really wanted to use those air assets to prove concept of operations. And then the mission transition, that was something that was a little new for us into a health and humanitarian services mission. And that was something that the program office actually held a conference call with all of the sponsoring agency chiefs from the deployed task forces to get the approval to be able to transition and use the task forces for that. Go ahead and advance. Some of the other things, standardized wide area search procedures, it's like a big database. Garbage in equals garbage out, which is a lot of the problem. So we spend a lot of time, especially in the early years of the federal USAR system, of searching areas that we knew were already searched by some element that were never documented appropriately. So if we search them the first time and document them appropriately, hopefully it's going to go a long way to be able to provide that qualification that that area has been searched. The GPS use and map symbology, they're things that we're working on from a federal work group perspective. And then the search definitions seem to change sometimes every time we go out. I know that people didn't want to term it a knock and walk. That wasn't good, but that's what we were terming it because we're going door to door, assessing, are people at home, aren't they at home, are people accounted for, do you know any neighbors that aren't accounted for, those types of things. So we really have standard search definitions that are in the catastrophic SAR annex, and we really need to stick to those and refer to those on a regular basis. We talked about defining those rules of engagement with the AHJ. We did have a fair amount of emergency demobilization and mobilization of personnel. We replaced a fair amount of personnel during the response, and is just going through that process to make sure that we have it down. We stressed our cold weather operations capability. It was actually pretty comfortable living in the tents. Wasn't that bad. And then the continued integration and use of the NGA assets, they were extremely beneficial to us to be able to provide mapping, the disaster atlas, like I showed you before. And that stuff makes our life a lot easier, having the maps and having them integrated with us in the field. Go ahead and advance. Some of the other things, life safety versus life sustainment. We discussed a lot of this stuff. When you take a look at it, this is kind of like an EMA kind of food chain, is that when you have weeks to restore power and heat, are people going to continue to live in those buildings? Are you going to move them out someplace else? When you have such a large affected population, how do you manage that? What are their shelter operations and needs? And, the bottom bullet is, when are conditions too bad for residents to continue to shelter in place? There's no heat, there's no light, there's no emergency, the emergency egress lighting, the batteries are long dead. And when is it a hazard to them to keep them in that area of operation? So go ahead and continue. Takeaways, again, that preparedness, all the other things that we talked about, thinking about the rules of engagement ahead of time, especially if you have other assets coming in. What are those rules of engagement going to be? If you have some sort of idea or somebody starts working on that ahead of time, then when the assets get on the ground, you already have those solidified. We actually took an operational period and a half to get the rules of engagement flushed out with the local authority having jurisdiction. Understanding what the resources that you have coming in can and can't do for you. We ended up eventually having 2 DMAT teams come in to set up out of the hospital on Long Beach to be able to provide services for those residents, since the hospital had been evacuated and the basement had been flooded. The logistical needs of the resources, when we get in the scene from a federal asset, we need area to be able to set up in, and we need a few other things to be able to keep us up and running, and understanding the footprint that we need to be able to sustain our operations, especially if you think you're going to get additional resources. Go ahead and advance, Julie. The other things are the situational awareness, common operating picture is a huge, and being able to maintain that. We talked about backup plans, the recovery activities, debris management for the local emergency management folks. We really didn't have a good point of distribution plan from the local emergency management folks. It seemed to be a roving point of distribution, so we couldn't really tell people to go to a specific site. When you have the DRCs or disaster recovery centers, when are they going to go live? Where are they designated at? That information those folks need to have. And the other thing is the vulnerable populations, and where they're at. Having that vulnerable client list was kind of crucial to us, and that information to be able to get us out to be able to start checking some of those residential occupancies where those folks were living. Go ahead and advance. You can go ahead and spin past this one. The bottom line is a challenging mission for us. It wasn't what we're used to doing. It was a wide area search and then followed by a humanitarian mission. But it was kind of interesting talking to the personnel that responded and said, listen, when we transitioned, this is not really something you signed up for. We signed up for breaking, breaching, cutting, burning operations and rescuing people in trapped structures. And not one of the guys said that they would not go out again and do something like this because they thought it was a very beneficial operation. But a lot of impacts to the operation. The biggest thing in the Rockaways were the issues with multiple people living in multi-residential dwellings that aren't going to have power for weeks or services, and that's what created a lot of the challenge of being able to manage it from an emergency management perspective. So it was a pretty successful deployment for us, especially considering it was the first time out of Philadelphia. It worked extremely well, but hopefully the presentation gave you some of the impacts to the area and some of the things that sometimes you don't always think about, especially like the multi-residential, multi-story buildings and how long they're going to be without services and some of the decision-making associated with that, especially from an emergency management perspective. And I don't know if we have time, Dwayne, but I can open it up to any questions at all.
Sure. Has anybody got any questions for Randy? Tim, you don't have any questions for Randy? I thought for sure, Randy, that Tim would throw you a hardball question, but maybe it's because he doesn't have a whiteboard to do it. So.
Well, I learned from the best as being a task force leader, so that's all I can say.
All right. Any questions for Randy? And if you're thinking of your question, you can put your hand up or shout out. Randy, appreciate it very, very much. Obviously, with what we do here and the training and the emergency management aspect, this kind of information is vitally important to our students, so we very much appreciate it. I don't see anybody raising their hand, so this will be archived also, and if you need it, Randy, you can let me know and I can send you the link, but we'll be archiving it for our student usage also. So thank you very much.
No problem. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, everybody have a great rest of your day. Hopefully the weather is going to turn. They say it's going to be a great weekend. And we'll see you all down the road.